My parents betrayed me, gave everything to my brother. Now they're begging me to save them, and then My family has always treated me like an afterthought, like I was some naive little girl who didn't understand how the world worked. It didn't matter that I had built something for myself, worked hard, and became financially independent. In their eyes, I was clueless, weak, and not worth taking seriously. Meanwhile, my older brother Jason could do no wrong. He had been handed everything on a silver platter. Our parents treated him like some kind of untouchable prince, despite the fact that he was lazy, reckless, and completely incapable of managing his own life. The family business was supposed to be a lasting legacy. My grandfather built it from nothing, turned it into a powerful enterprise, and expected it to support our family for generations. But after he passed, my parents took over, and eventually, they handed everything to Jason. He wasn't just irresponsible. He was completely out of control. He treated the company like his personal piggy bank, blowing through money like it was infinite. Lavish vacations, expensive cars, designer clothes. He lived like a king, even though the empire he thought he ruled was rotting beneath his feet. I had spent years watching the company decline, seeing the warning signs that no one else wanted to acknowledge. Suppliers weren't being paid on time. Employees were quitting over missed paychecks. Banks were denying loan applications. There were whispers about legal trouble on the horizon. I tried bringing it up once, just to see how my father would react. He scoffed, shook his head, and dismissed me like always. Business is complicated, he told me, as if I was too simple-minded to understand. That was the moment I realized there was no point in arguing. They would never take me seriously, so I stopped trying. Instead, I let them believe whatever they wanted. They assumed I was barely scraping by, just because I wasn't constantly showing off wealth like Jason did. In reality, I had built something far more valuable than a flashy lifestyle. I had built security. I had put myself through college on a scholarship, worked hard, made smart investments, and grown my savings. While my brother was drowning in debt, I was financially stable, but they never bothered to see that. Then, I found out the final betrayal. My parents had rewritten their will, leaving nearly everything to Jason: the company, the house, the remaining assets. They had decided a long time ago that he was the only one who mattered, that I wasn't even part of the equation. Their reasoning? Sophia wouldn't know what to do with it anyway. I wasn't even surprised. It was almost laughable. They thought I was too clueless to handle money, while Jason was actively running the business into the ground. I could have fought them right then and there, but what would have been the point? They would never listen. Instead, I nodded along, played the role they had written for me, and let them believe I was exactly who they thought I was. And while they were busy underestimating me, I started gathering information. I had no intention of saving them, no desire to prove myself to people who had already decided I wasn't worth anything. But I was going to be ready when the inevitable collapse finally came. The first real crack in their delusion came when my parents started making comments about unexpected struggles and how family supports each other. They never outright asked for money, not at first. That would have meant admitting they needed my help. Instead, they started laying the groundwork, testing the waters to see if I would be willing to step in. Jason, of course, said nothing. He still believed everything would work out for him in the end, just like it always had. Then, my parents finally broke down and admitted the truth. They weren't just struggling, they were desperate. The company was on the verge of collapse, and they needed financial help to keep it afloat. But instead of asking nicely, instead of acknowledging that they had dismissed me for years, they made it sound like an obligation. Like it was my duty to hand over my savings and clean up their mess. I wasn't stupid. I knew if I refused outright, they would just double down, guilt-trip me, and paint me as the villain. No, if I was going to do this, I was going to do it my way. So, I acted hesitant. I played the part they expected. I told them I needed time to figure things out, and that I wanted to understand what was going on before I committed to anything. They bought it immediately. Jason even laughed, patting me on the shoulder like I was a child playing pretend. That was their biggest mistake. While they thought I was dragging my feet, I was already setting my plan in motion. I told them I wanted to learn how the business worked before investing, pretending I was just a nervous little sister who needed reassurance. My parents looked relieved, convinced they had finally gotten me to trust them. Jason waved me off, telling me not to stress too much over the complicated business stuff. And then, they handed me everything: the financial records, the reports, the internal documents, thinking I wouldn't actually go through them. I was supposed to skim, nod along, and hand over my money like a good little girl. Instead, I spent hours reviewing everything, and what I found was even worse than I had imagined. The debts were massive, some dating back years. Suppliers hadn't been paid on time. Multiple lawsuits were pending from vendors who had been strung along with false promises. Jason had taken out loans using the business as collateral, assuming the company would always make enough to cover them. He wasn't just spending recklessly, he was gambling. I returned the documents the next day, keeping my face blank. "Wow," I said, forcing admiration into my voice. "I had no idea running a business was so complicated. You guys are amazing for handling all of this." Jason smirked, eating up the fake praise. My parents looked proud, like they had finally gotten me to see reason. They had no idea they had just handed me the information I needed to destroy them. But I wasn't done yet. I had already found a way in. Decades ago, my grandfather had issued company shares to early investors, many of whom had long since passed away or moved on without claiming ownership. These records had been buried in outdated company filings, overlooked because my family had never expected anyone to dig into them. Through a series of discrete transactions, I started acquiring control over these forgotten shares, increasing my stake in the company without raising suspicion. My family had never considered this possibility because in their minds, I wasn't interested in business. They assumed I would never look into ownership. But with each share I acquired, I gained more control. And when the moment was right, I was going to take everything they had ever denied me. Jason still thought he had everything under control, completely unaware that I was already positioning myself to take him down. He continued living as if nothing had changed, posting pictures from luxury resorts, flashing his latest overpriced watch, and throwing around money he didn't have. My parents still clung to the illusion that he was the future of the family, still convinced that his reckless spending was just part of his business strategy. Meanwhile, I kept working behind the scenes, strengthening my position and preparing for the inevitable collapse. Through careful digging, I uncovered something even more damning than I had expected. Jason wasn't just mismanaging funds. He had been forging financial reports, inflating the company's revenue to secure loans that should have never been approved in the first place. He had misled investors, defaulted on payments, and was dangerously close to getting the company blacklisted from major financial institutions. If any of these loans were called in at once, it wouldn't just mean trouble, it would mean instant ruin. I needed to be careful. If I exposed him too soon, he and my parents would find a way to cover it up, just like they always had. I had to make sure that when he fell, there would be no getting back up. I reached out to Mark, a forensic accountant with a reputation for uncovering corporate fraud. At first, I framed it as an investment question, something casual, something harmless, but Mark wasn't an idiot. He took one look at the numbers and called me back that same night. "This company isn't just in trouble," he said. "It's a disaster waiting to happen. If this comes out, Jason isn't walking away with a slap on the wrist. He's looking at lawsuits, possible criminal charges, and a financial mess so deep he'll never recover." That was exactly what I needed to hear. The problem was, my parents were still enabling him. Despite knowing that the company was barely holding together, they were still covering for Jason, still throwing money at the problem as if that would fix anything. But that money was running out. Their personal accounts were being drained to cover the company's expenses. Their house had been put up as collateral for yet another one of Jason's loans, and payments were already falling behind. My parents didn't know it yet, but foreclosure was looming. I could see the shift happening in real time. They had spent years treating me like an afterthought, but now, suddenly, they were being friendlier. My mother started bringing up family memories more often, reminding me how we always look out for each other. My father spoke about hard times and how families should stick together. They were still too proud to outright ask for my help, but the desperation was creeping in. Jason, on the other hand, remained oblivious. He still acted like everything would work itself out, like money would just appear out of thin air, like there would always be someone to clean up his mess. I let them believe I was falling for it. I told them I was open to investing in the company, but I needed to sit down and discuss the terms first. My father jumped at the chance, clearly convinced that they had me exactly where they wanted me. Jason just laughed, waving me off like I was a child pretending to play grown-up. My mother looked relieved, probably thinking that I was finally coming to my senses. What none of them realized was that I had already set the stage for their downfall. The day of the meeting, Jason walked in smug, already assuming he had won. My parents sat beside him, their expressions carefully neutral, but I could see the relief in their eyes. They thought this was it. They thought I was about to save them. I let them go on about the company's potential, about the temporary struggles, and how a little investment could get everything back on track. They were still trying to convince me, still treating me like I didn't understand how bad things actually were. Then, I made my move. "I'll invest," I said, pausing just long enough to see the way Jason sat up straighter, his smirk widening. "But I want a major stake in the company." For the first time, the room went silent. Jason's smirk faltered, but he still didn't take me seriously. "What? You want to play business owner now?" he scoffed. My father frowned, but I could see the gears turning in his head. My mother hesitated, glancing at him for direction. They were unsure, but they were desperate. They still thought they could control me. After a long silence, my father nodded. "It's just a technicality," he assured Jason. "She'll still be part of the family. We can guide her." He thought I was just some naive girl who needed hand-holding. Jason, still convinced that he could push me around, rolled his eyes and said, "Fine, whatever. Just sign the damn papers." I did. The moment the ink dried, everything changed. Jason thought this was a game, but I had just legally made myself one of the most powerful people in the company. I now had the right to review financials, approve decisions, and, most importantly, challenge leadership. Jason had just signed away his own authority without even realizing it. The next morning, I hired an external auditing firm, one with no ties to my family, no loyalty to Jason, and no reason to cover for him. As expected, the red flags were everywhere. Massive debts, fake profits, missing funds. All the lies Jason had built his empire on were finally coming to light. The moment the first audit report was in my hands, I knew Jason's time was up. At the next company meeting, I started asking real questions. I pointed out discrepancies in financial records. I brought up missing invoices, unaccounted for expenses, and why employees had gone months without proper pay. Jason tried to brush it off, claiming it was complicated and that I wouldn't understand. But for the first time, he was on the defensive. Word started spreading. Investors who had already been uneasy started pulling out. Employees who had once been too afraid to speak up started whispering in the hallways. The suppliers who had been waiting on payments stopped giving extensions. The cracks in Jason's empire were no longer just visible. They were splitting wide open. Jason, realizing things were shifting, tried to assert control again. He called for an emergency restructuring meeting, attempting to limit my decision-making power, but he had already signed over too much. He had no legal way to override me. And worse, the banks had finally caught on. The day after our meeting, my parents received a letter from the bank. The foreclosure process had officially begun. Their house, the house they had always believed was untouchable, was about to be taken from them. They had no savings left. Jason had burned through everything, and there was nothing left to bail them out. I could have told them. I could have warned them, given them a chance to prepare. Instead, I stayed quiet and let them finally feel what it was like to have everything pulled out from under them. Jason still had no idea what was coming. He was too busy trying to convince himself that he could fix this, too arrogant to see that he was already losing, too blinded by his own ego to realize that I had played him from the very start. Jason had spent his entire life believing he was untouchable. No matter how much money he wasted, no matter how many reckless decisions he made, there was always someone to clean up after him. But this time, there was no one left. The bank had officially started the foreclosure process on my parents' house. Investors were pulling out faster than they could spin excuses, and suppliers had completely cut them off. The cracks had widened into a full-blown collapse, but Jason, in his delusional arrogance, still refused to see it. He carried himself with the same smug confidence, acting as if everything was under control, as if all he had to do was wait for things to magically fix themselves. At first, my parents tried to keep up the act, pretending that this was just a temporary setback. But the moment their credit cards started getting declined, reality finally started sinking in. My mother called me one evening, her voice unnervingly sweet, asking if I could come over to talk. She still thought she could manipulate me, still believed I was stupid enough to fall for the same guilt trips they had been using my entire life. I went, but not because I felt any obligation to help them. I wanted to see just how desperate they had become. When I arrived, my father was already pacing, running a hand through his graying hair, while my mother sat stiffly on the couch, trying to maintain some level of dignity. They didn't waste time with small talk. My father launched straight into how family sticks together and how we need to present a united front during tough times. My mother played the role of the concerned parent, saying she knew I had some money set aside and that this was the time to prove I truly cared about my family. They weren't asking, they were expecting. I let them talk, nodding at all the right moments, pretending to consider it. Then, when they finally asked me how much I was willing to contribute, I tilted my head and smiled. How much is Jason putting in? Silence. For the first time, my mother looked uncomfortable. My father cleared his throat. Your brother's situation is complicated, he said, like that was supposed to mean anything. So is mine, I replied. Jason, of course, wasn't there. He hadn't even bothered to show up to the meeting where they were essentially begging for a bailout. My father tried to reason with me, claiming that Jason had invested his whole life into the business, that it was different for him, that I didn't understand what was at stake. That was when I finally dropped the act. Oh, I understand, I said, leaning forward. I understand that you gave him everything, and now that it's crumbling, you want me to fix it. I understand that the only reason you're even looking at me right now is because you have no other options. And I understand that if I handed you money today, Jason would still be flying off to another vacation by tomorrow. My mother gasped, as if I had said something outrageous. My father narrowed his eyes, his voice turning sharp. This isn't the time for grudges. No, I agreed, standing up. It's the time for consequences. I left them sitting there, stunned, with no more excuses to hide behind. That night, Jason finally realized something was wrong. Maybe my parents told him about our conversation, or maybe he had finally noticed that no one was rushing to save him. Either way, I got a text from him, short, aggressive, and full of entitlement. Are you seriously not helping mom and dad? Unbelievable. I didn't reply. There was nothing to say. The next morning, I made my final move. I called an emergency board meeting, something only a major shareholder could do, and thanks to Jason's stupidity, I was exactly that. He showed up, still cocky, still convinced that he could talk his way out of this. My parents weren't invited, and I could tell that unsettled him. He kept glancing at the empty seats, as if waiting for backup that would never come. I started the meeting the way he always did, by reviewing the financial reports. But unlike him, I actually understood the numbers. One by one, I went through the real state of the company, exposing the falsified reports, the missing money, the unpaid debts, and the countless bad decisions that had led to this moment. I made sure everyone in that room saw the truth. Jason tried to interrupt, to deflect, to make excuses. You don't know what you're talking about, he snapped, shaking his head. This is just how business works. You have to take risks. This wasn't a risk, I countered, flipping through one of the reports. This was fraud. That word, fraud, landed like a bomb in the room. I watched as the reality of the situation finally started sinking in for everyone. The remaining board members exchanged uneasy glances. Jason's face turned red. He knew exactly what was happening, and for the first time in his life, he was losing control. I called for a vote of no confidence. Jason fought it, of course. He yelled. He made threats. He accused me of manipulating the situation. But it didn't matter. The vote was unanimous. Jason was officially removed from the company. It was over. But Jason wasn't someone who knew how to lose gracefully. Instead of accepting defeat, he did what he always did. He lashed out. He called my parents, probably crying to them about how I had stabbed him in the back. Then he started calling extended family, spinning a story about how I had betrayed him, stolen his company, and left our parents with nothing. My parents, ever loyal to their golden child, backed him up completely. They told anyone who would listen that I had ruined them, that I had turned on my own family in their time of need. They left out the part where they had rewritten the will to cut me out of everything. They left out the part where Jason had nearly bankrupted them. They left out the part where they had expected me to pay for his mistakes. At first, I ignored it. Let them talk. Let them spread their version of events. I had the company. I had control. They had nothing. Then Jason made his biggest mistake yet. He tried to sue me. The lawsuit was laughable. He claimed I had tricked him into signing away his shares, that I had manipulated him into giving up control. He actually thought the court would sympathize with him. that they would undo everything and hand him back the power he had lost. What he didn't realize was that suing me meant opening the company's financial records to legal scrutiny. And once those records were examined, everything came out. The falsified reports, the unpaid debts, the missing money. Jason had spent years keeping his fraud hidden behind flashy distractions and fake success. Now, it was all being laid out for the courts to see. The lawsuit was thrown out immediately, and instead of winning back the company, Jason had exposed himself to potential criminal charges. And just like that, the last of his supporters vanished. Investors pulled out completely. The few remaining employees who had still believed in him walked away. The suppliers who had been willing to renegotiate contracts cut ties permanently. Jason wasn't just losing the company. He was losing his entire reputation. Then, the final blow came. His car, one of the many expensive toys he had bought on credit, was repossessed right outside the office. Employees watched as a tow truck hauled it away. For the first time, Jason truly looked lost. For the first time, he understood that no one was coming to save him. Jason had spent his whole life believing that no matter how badly he screwed up, someone would always be there to bail him out. But as he stood in front of the office, watching his luxury SUV get hauled away by a tow truck, it was clear that safety net had finally disappeared. He didn't say a word as the employees whispered among themselves, some hiding their amusement, others shaking their heads at the man who had once acted like he was untouchable. He stormed back inside, slamming the door so hard that the sound echoed through the nearly empty office. That was the first time I saw it, the realization in his eyes that he had truly lost. But even then, Jason wasn't ready to accept the consequences of his actions. The very next day, he showed up unannounced at my office, barging in like he still had power, still had control, like he could intimidate me into fixing the mess he created. I didn't even look up when he slammed his hands onto my desk. "I hope you're happy," he spat, his voice shaking with barely contained rage. "You've ruined everything. You think you're so much better than me? You think you won." I finally met his gaze, tilting my head slightly. "I don't think I won, Jason. I know I did." His face turned red, his hands curling into fists at his sides, but he couldn't argue with me. He had nothing left. The company was no longer his. His accounts had been frozen due to pending fraud investigations, and now the bank was coming after the house our parents had put up as collateral. "You can still fix this," he said, his voice dropping to something almost desperate. "You can tell the bank to back off. You can get investors to come back. This doesn't have to be the end." I leaned back in my chair, studying him like he was some kind of fascinating case study. "You still don't get it, do you?" I asked, shaking my head. "No one wants to be associated with you anymore. The investors have written you off as a lost cause. The banks won't touch you. You don't have a single thing left to offer." His jaw clenched, but I saw the panic creeping in, the reality setting in behind his eyes. "Then give me a job," he finally said, the words sounding like they physically pained him to say. "Let me work for the company." "I can't." I cut him off with a laugh. "You? Work?" I scoffed. "Jason, you've never worked a day in your life. You've spent years burning everything you've touched, treating people like they were disposable, and now you want me to hand you a second chance." I stood up, walking around my desk until I was standing right in front of him. "You don't deserve one." His expression twisted with fury, but before he could say anything else, I pointed toward the door. "Get out." He hesitated for a moment, as if trying to come up with one last desperate excuse, but there was nothing left to say. He turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. The fallout from his failure hit my parents even harder than it hit Jason. At first, they still clung to the hope that things would turn around, that somehow their golden child would rise from the ashes and reclaim everything he had lost. But that illusion shattered the moment they received the official foreclosure notice. Their house, the one they had bragged about for years, the one they had assumed was untouchable, was being taken by the bank. My mother broke first, calling me in tears, telling me that she had nowhere to go, that she and my father had given everything to that company, and now they had nothing left. My father was still trying to act like he had control of the situation, but I could hear it in his voice. The fear, the desperation, the quiet acceptance that for the first time in his life, he had backed the wrong horse. They asked me to fix it, as if all the years they had ignored me, belittled me, and treated me like I didn't matter had never happened. They weren't apologizing, not really. They were just trying to survive. I let them talk. I let them beg. And then, I simply told them no. That was the moment the tide truly turned. My parents had spent years propping Jason up, defending his actions, convincing themselves that I was the lesser of their two children. Now, Jason had nothing, and they had no choice but to turn to me. The daughter they had disregarded, the one they had left out of their will, the one they had assumed would never amount to anything. But I had no interest in saving them. I had spent too many years being cast aside, too many years watching them funnel all their love, attention, and resources into Jason while expecting me to fend for myself. Now, they could see what it felt like. Word spread fast. Extended family members who had once been on Jason's side started realizing the truth, watching in real time as the golden child they had once admired crumbled under the weight of his own failures. Some of them tried to reach out to me, acting like they had never doubted me, like they had always believed in me. Others, still loyal to my parents, tried guilt-tripping me, saying that family should always take care of each other, that I was being heartless by letting my parents struggle. But I ignored them all. They hadn't cared about me when Jason was on top, and I wasn't about to care about them now. Jason, still unable to accept his downfall, tried one last scheme. He attempted to sell off company assets, furniture, equipment, anything he could get his hands on, to get quick cash before the company fully stabilized under my leadership. But I had already anticipated that move and had locked down all major transactions. His attempted sale was blocked immediately, and when the news got out, it only solidified his reputation as a failure. If there was any last shred of credibility he had left, it was gone now. And then, in what was possibly the most pathetic move of all, Jason launched a GoFundMe. The title? Victim of Corporate Sabotage, Help Me Rebuild My Life. He spun a story about how he had been betrayed by his own sister, about how I had stolen his company, ruined his reputation, and left him with nothing. He painted himself as the tragic hero, a businessman who had lost everything to greed and backstabbing. But it didn't work. The internet didn't buy it. People mocked him relentlessly, reposting screenshots of his past luxury vacations, his reckless spending, and his fraud. Comments flooded in calling him out, pointing out that he had done this to himself, that he had burned every bridge and now wanted people to pay for his mistakes. His fundraiser barely made anything before he deleted it in humiliation. Meanwhile, the company, my company, was thriving. With Jason gone, with the corruption purged, and with real leadership in place, we were stronger than ever. Investors started returning, cautious but interested in seeing where things would go. Employees who had suffered under Jason's rule finally had stability, and for the first time in years, the company was growing instead of sinking. The name that Jason had tarnished was being rebuilt, and with every success, I made it clear that the only thing that had ever held us back was him. Jason had nothing left. No money, no home, no support system. His credit was destroyed, his reputation in shambles, and even the people who had once defended him were distancing themselves. He tried applying for jobs, but no company would touch him, not after the fraud, not after the lawsuits. He had burned too many bridges, ruined too many opportunities, and now there was nowhere left to turn. Jason had always believed he was destined for greatness, that no matter how many times he failed, the world would find a way to put him back on top. But reality had finally caught up with him. His reputation was in ruins, his last desperate attempts to manipulate the situation had blown up in his face, and even our parents, who had spent years defending him, were starting to understand that there was no coming back from this. He had no home, no money, and no future, but instead of accepting his fate, he kept trying to claw his way back to relevance. He attempted to start another business, convinced that if I could succeed, he could do it better. But he had no investors, no funding, and no one willing to take the risk. Every potential partner walked away the moment they saw his name attached to the project. The few people who still entertained his ideas quickly realized he had no plan, no strategy, just empty confidence and the same reckless habits that had destroyed him in the first place. Within months, the business collapsed before it even got off the ground, and the humiliation was worse than ever. The people who had once admired him now mocked him openly, using him as a cautionary tale of what happens when entitlement meets incompetence. Meanwhile, my parents were falling apart. They had been so sure that Jason would fix everything, that if they just supported him a little longer, he would find a way to rebuild. But with every failure, Their belief in him crumbled. They had lost everything: the house, the business, their financial security, and now, the people they had once considered friends wanted nothing to do with them. The same wealthy social circles they had spent years trying to impress had abandoned them, unwilling to associate with a family that had gone from power to disgrace. And then, in a final act of desperation, they came to me. They requested a meeting at my office, no longer demanding, no longer trying to guilt-trip me. For the first time in my life, they spoke to me with politeness, with caution, as if they finally understood that I was the one in control now. They didn't ask for money. They didn't ask me to fix their lives. Instead, they asked for jobs. My parents, who had spent years dismissing me, belittling me, and treating me like I was nothing, were now asking me for a place in the company they had once refused to let me be a part of. I didn't hesitate. I told them I only hired people who took responsibility for their failures. My mother's face crumbled, my father's expression hardened, but neither of them argued. They had no fight left in them. I told them to leave, and they did. They knew there was nothing more to say. Without my help, they had no options left. They moved into a small apartment, far from the luxury they had once lived in, forced to survive without the wealth they had always taken for granted. And Jason? He disappeared completely. No social media, no business ventures, no connections. He had become exactly what he had always feared: irrelevant.